An extremely important realm to consider in our course is advocacy for education. And this was a means to chip away at the institutional barriers that separated people with disabilities from the community at large. By the late 1960s, there was increasing opposition by parents, by disability educators, and disability advocates to the status quo in education, and an increasing push for mainstreaming rather than isolating children in educational settings. This push was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1971, stemming from a 1969 lawsuit by the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens versus the state of Pennsylvania. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the state of Pennsylvania in 1972, which had sought to deny any obligation to educate children after the age of 8 if they did not meet certain intellectual standards. The Supreme Court ruled that the standards were the problem, not the children, and that the children had a right to free and equal education. Such effort and advocacy led to federal legislation on the issue. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. Its name was changed later to the current Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, again reflecting changes in language and nomenclature. This law sought to ensure access to educational opportunities for all children, and this should be in the least restrictive environment that was fitting. That is, the starting point was not separation, but integration. Education was instrumental in providing pathways for opportunity, and this brings us back to the very start of our course with our introductory video on Ed Roberts. Recall how he had applied to UC Berkeley but faced resistance both from the University of California and the state of California. The former did not want to let him enroll because of his disability, and the latter didn't want to pay for his education because it assessed that he was unemployable, you recall. Such was the state of society at the time that both judgments were considered not only reasonable, but also completely legal. So Ed Roberts had to fight the state of California and the University of California, and he overcame both. Ed's residence at UC Berkeley was on the top floor of the university's health center, the Cowell Hospital, and soon this trailblazer was joined by others, with a dozen students living there by 1969. For these college students, this was the first time away from home, and they experienced a new level of independence, a level of freedom from their families, and a new community of peer support. Now, this is not an unusual situation for anyone going to college. But when a new rehabilitation counselor tried to impose more stringent academic and conduct rules on this new community, the students mobilized in opposition. Since they were all wheelchair users, they named their group the Rolling Quads. Seeking to transition from an informal group to a formal campus organization, the group applied for and received an $80,000 grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which they used to launch the Physically Disabled Students Program, which would focus on issues of housing and accessibility for students. Fundamentally, the issue of concern was independence. People with disabilities have a right to live their own lives, to confront and address issues that restricted them, like housing and physical accessibility on campus, as well as the streets around the campus. So here they created an organization led by people with disabilities, serving people with disabilities. But how would they keep the program going once the grant was used up? This would require ongoing funding. For this, the group proposed a 25-cent student fee and this was approved by the students of UC Berkeley. This student program then led to a community organization to expand the scope from the university to the city, and this was the emergence of the independent living movement. In 1972, thanks in part to a $50,000 federal grant, the Center for Independent Living was founded as a community-based organization led by people with disabilities and focused on the local community with a desire to influence the nation at large. To ensure that this would be a program led by and serving people with disabilities, the organization's bylaws state that the board would consist of 51% of people identifying as having a disability. At least 51%, that is. Now, contrast this with the rise of the institutions that we have previously examined. The Center for Independent Living aimed at ensuring that people with disabilities could live lives that they directed, with access to housing and medical care and the surrounding environment. The approach of the Center for Independent Living was not to propose standards like federal and state laws, but to ensure that there was a process of asking and listening, that there was a community engagement. And we must ask, what is needed to help? The city of Berkeley listened to the growing movement and the protests that were happening at the time, and they were willing to ask this question, making city curbs accessible by adding curb cuts in the heart of the city. And then they declared that all new street construction would be made accessible, requiring that the city manager listen to community members before implementing any changes. An example of the need for listening can be seen in the case of the area's public transportation system. That is known as the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, or BART for short. In 1975, BART reached out to the Center for Independent Living, wondering why so few people with disabilities were using it after BART had installed elevators and braille signs and disabled parking. BART consulted with the CIL, the Center for Independent Living, and found that the problem wasn't entirely BART. While many people with disabilities had not used it before because it was inaccessible, now that the changes were made, what happened? Well, what they learned was that BART made wonderful changes, but the problem was, at the destinations, did those changes continue outside? That is, were there accessible buses? Were the sidewalks using curb cuts to make movement possible? And so what BART thought it solved only uncovered that there really was a bigger problem, and that came through the conversations. If accessibility was not possible outside of the BART station, then using BART was less likely. The process of asking and listening led to progress in the work of expanding access. The same year, 1975, the new director of the Center for Independent Living would continue this work and help expand this to a truly national level. The Center for Independent Living would become both a source of advocacy as well as a community of support as the independent living movement and the model of this Center for Independent Living spread nationwide. And that new leader's name was Judy Heumann.